At this time, I'd like to welcome Sal Peralta. Sal lives here in McMinnville with his wife, Dr. Tanya Tompkins. He is a government relations and nonprofit management consultant who currently serves as the interim executive director for the Oregon Public Defense Consortium Association. He is a co-founder of the Independent Party of Oregon. Welcome.
Kind of telling stories about my history. That music was so beautiful. I don't know why this happened, but about 5 years ago, sometimes when I hear music like that, it actually brings tears to my eyes. And I don't know if anybody else experiences that, but thank you. Good morning, Jay, Ken, congregants. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. I'd also like to thank Pat Stanfield for her infinite patience and my delays in sending her information about this speech to share with all of you. I'm really grateful for Pat. Ken actually gave me the title of this speech about a week ago after I described it to him, and you can tell that he's a retired engineering manager based on how quickly he solved a problem that I was agonizing over for weeks. You're a beacon of light, Ken, in this community, and I really appreciate you. I know several people in this congregation, but for those who haven't met me yet, I'm Sal Peralta. I'm a member of the City Council, and as was mentioned, I've been active in public service and government relations for about the entire time I've lived in Oregon, which is a little over 20 years. Because I'm not a member of the Unitarian Universalist faith, in preparing for this speech, I took the time to read the 6 principles and 7 guidelines of the Unitarian Church, and I was surprised that I found myself in accordance with all of these articles of faith. In particular, I found myself drawn to the 6 sources of the faith's living tradition, in particular that we should challenge structures of evil with justice, compassion, and the transforming power of love. I'm drawn towards the idea of Christian and Hebrew teachings that call on us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. Although I'd like to make an addendum to that, which is I think that we should also be much kinder to ourselves than many of us often are. Many of us are harder on ourselves than we would ever think of being towards other people, and I think we should reflect on that. I'm drawn towards humanist teachings that counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science, and that warn us against the idolatries of mind and spirit, and with spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions that celebrate the sacred circle of life and instruct us to live in harmony with the rhythms of nature. And on that last point, I'd like to mention that while the calendar today says winter, and February is one of our region's coldest months, and we've been in the middle of pretty heavy rains, it's also a time when the darkest part of night is receding. This is a time of year that always gives me hope. The sun's rising earlier, it's setting later, and because we live in such a temperate place, we can already see the promise of spring. Early bloomers like daffodils and Oregon grape are starting to grow into bud and flower. The ground is alive with living roots, soaking up moisture. Pupae are growing around those roots and waiting to emerge as caterpillars that will eventually take flight on wings that someone who's not familiar with that process would think is a miracle and could never predict. Oregon native plant gardeners know that winter is the time to take out weeds and to plant new plants because it's easier to remove unwanted plants now by the root while the ground is still wet. And because of the cool temperatures and wet soil, any harm to the desired plants is minimized while they're in their dormancy or they're just starting to grow. Now, I'm not sharing all of this with you to inspire you towards native plant gardening. Although the Soil and Water Conservation District plant sale is happening March 1st and 2nd at the Heritage Center here in McMinnville. Pre-orders are closing soon on the website, and they'll also have things to sell at the event. I mention it because just as there are natural seasons and rhythms to tending a garden, when to make a decision about what to plant and where, when to weed, when to sow seeds, and when to plant and when to harvest, there's also natural rhythms that we need to pay attention to in cultivating a healthy life and a healthy community. As with gardening, I think it's important that we take the time to think about the things that we want, habits of mind and practice, community problems that we'd like to solve, institutions that we would like to nurture, and we'd like to encourage and cultivate those things, in large part by weeding out some of the things that we don't want or that aren't serving us well. These idolatries of the mind and spirit, habits of the mind and practices of the culture that deserve intentional reflection from time to time. For myself, reflecting on many of the changes in behavior of elected officials, candidates, and ideological activists that I've seen over the last 30 years, and especially during the last 8 years, have me thinking a great deal about the negative consequences of rising polarization in the country. What is political polarization? I think of it as sort of a linear scale that measures the degree of social cohesion in a society, from one of low polarization, where people hold positive attitudes and have positive regard for one another, to one of high polarization, in which people are dehumanized and hold contempt for one another over characteristics like race or gender, religion, ideology, creed, party affiliation. In my view, the latter often serves structures of power and privilege, both real and perceived, and often reinforce inequalities and injustices. And as we've seen in recent years, there's been a significant rise in polarization and negative attitudes towards politics and people who hold different political views. It's important to remember these perceptions are not held uniformly across the public. The loudest voices, the ones who are shaping the conversation, are creating a somewhat false impression about the broader political context, or the broader context in which their views are taking place. And according to the Carnegie Endowment for Peace, the more politically engaged people are, the more likely they are to hold these attitudes, the more likely they are to hold false perceptions, false negative perceptions about the other side. In fact, these attitudes, unfortunately, are strongest among the people running our major political institutions like Congress and state legislatures. And I find this both ironic and troubling. It's ironic because the main point in establishing our federal system of government in the United States was to form a more perfect union, to establish justice, provide for the common defense, and ensure domestic tranquility for ourselves and our posterity. Few things are more harmful to those goals than high levels of polarization. And yet, according to the Pew Research Center, in the last 8 years, increasing numbers of Democrats and Republicans see their opponents as more closed-minded, more dishonest, more immoral, unintelligent, lazy. The percentage of political partisans who perceive their opponents in these ways as having 4 or more of these traits has risen from about 25% to more than half. This is troubling, obviously, for several reasons. As people begin to hold beliefs of contempt or dehumanization, especially in the political arena, it becomes more justifiable to engage in unethical conduct. As leaders engage in dehumanizing conduct, it becomes more normalized among their followers. I see this as a sort of negative reinforcing death spiral. And I'm sure I see by the nods and the heads, many of you see this too. So how do we get out of it? One of the first things I think we can do is to understand something that partisan media organizations, political candidates, and nonprofits that engage in ideological organizing all understand, because the research is very clear on this point. Humans are primed to trust sources that are perceived to be part of the same culture or affiliation, and appeals by those sources to the biases or fears of people with shared beliefs is one of the most powerful ways to get people to vote in a certain way. Because groups and candidates have been rewarded for this kind of negative messaging, it's now overpracticed. It's become a standard operating procedure in political campaigns and communications by nonprofits and partisan media to cater to people's fears and biases to the point where polarizations become the norm. where once this kind of acrimony was limited to Congress, it seeped down to the local level to the point where even political violence is becoming more normalized. But there are things that social science tells us that inform us of a way out. First, again, while most people believe their opponents operate irrationally out of malice, most people are actually being motivated by fear. Second, people are far less likely to change their culture or values. People will go to war over their culture and their values than they are to change their opinion on issues when the issue is either not central to the person's core beliefs or when they can be made to understand how the issue aligns or intersects with their core beliefs. So again, one of the most common misperceptions that people have is that groups are primarily voted based on hatred or contempt, when in fact they're voting oftentimes based on fear. Now, the negative attitudes that people have when they hold these perceptions are perceived to be fully rational. They might be economic fears about immigration that cater to the person's unconscious racial bias. They might be fears about changes in culture related to changes in greater acceptance of people who don't conform to traditional gender identities. Or they could be fears about other cultural issues like just higher fuel prices as we try and engage with climate change. So those are the fears that people have. But we should also recognize that most Americans are not actually as divided on a lot of these issues as our politics suggest. Most people believe in justice. Most people believe in fairness. Most people don't want to see others suffer. They want good schools. People want a good, clean, safe environment to live in and a life with purpose and a thriving community. And what is, again, getting in a way of that social cohesion around these issues is the fact that Americans are getting their information about the world from very different sources. And while some of these sources may be highly propagandizing and biased, it's important to remember that they can also be central to people's identity and how they understand the world. And given the strong association between the media we consume and identity, social science suggests that listening and asking questions is a better way to get people to reevaluate their worlds than their worldview than verbal jousting. And finally, I think another part of the solution is just paying attention to the degree to which the elected officials and identity groups, often ones that we align with most closely, engage in the kind of fear-based or polemical, polarizing, or dehumanizing rhetoric that I'm describing. The degree to which our own allies cater to our own biases in this way, because it contributes to this kind of death spiral. And we need to demand better of the elected officials that we support, the groups that we support, discourage this kind of dehumanizing approach. Addressing that within one's own tribe, so to speak, requires a lot of moral courage to do. But I think you'll find, as Martin Luther King suggested, a person who takes a stand for justice will find themselves with allies in every corner of the world. So I'd like to leave you to think about how some of these things color our social interactions and how we might use some of this information as we speak to our family, people in our workplace, people in our neighborhoods, social media, etc. Because what the social science also tells us is that building community, finding common ground on things that are unrelated to divisive issues or where we can find points of agreement around those issues, around our shared values, and spending more time in fellowship with one another are the strongest antidotes to polarization, and ultimately that gives me hope. That's what I have. Do you want to get back to your questions? Or are you... Okay.
Thank you, Sal. At this time, we'll take a 3-minute meditation. Thinking about what has been shared, let us take a breath and enter a time of silence and meditation that will last for 3 minutes.